Rising from the rubble of the Civil War emerged a group in the South whose ultimate goal was a counter-revolution, their reaction to losing to the North. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. Led by former white Confederate officers and soldiers, the KKK grew quickly, brutalizing former slaves and sympathetic whites all across the war-torn South. You describe it as the first organized terrorist movement in American history.
The white reactionaries who formed the Ku Klux Klan and attempted to overthrow Reconstruction were proud of being white supremacists. Right. They used the term. Yeah. And similarly, people who were victims of the Klan or observing the Klan did use the word terror and terrorism.
In his latest book, Klan War, Ulysses S. Grant and the Battle to Save Reconstruction, historian and author Fergus Bordewich sets the record straight about two-term President Grant and his efforts to use the federal government to suppress the Klan.
He was a victim of the lost cause ideology which prevailed for that 100 years. And if you look at Grant through the lens of civil rights, human rights, you see a heroic figure, not a failure.
Fergus Bordewich, welcome to St. Louis.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I learned a lot from the book and this ugly chapter in American history. What was missing from other history books that you felt you needed to write Klan War?
The whole period of Reconstruction from approximately 1865 to 1876 has been wildly misunderstood for almost 100 years, give or take. Reconstruction, in its own time, was an ambitious, forward-looking, in today's terms you would say progressive, attempt to refound the United States on a basis of fairness and equality. Think of the post-war amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, and so on, to transform the economy of the South away from a slave-based, aristocratic economy into one more based on industry and small farming, like the North, and so on. This is very forward-looking. Right. And to include Black Americans, 4 million freed people, in that refounded America. That truth of Reconstruction was, dare I say, revised, reinvented by the lost cause defenders of the Confederacy and the Confederate cause, who ultimately prevailed over Reconstruction, and then for about 100 years influenced the entire country in coming to think of Reconstruction as a catastrophe, a failure, just a mismanaged, bloody business run by corrupt individuals, black and white. And anybody who was educated before the last 20, 30 years more or less absorbed that. Mm-hmm. And what I've tried to do in this book, and other writers have also been trying to do, is to go back to what Reconstruction really was, what was really at stake.
I guess a victim of that misinformation is Ulysses S. Grant. Ron Chernow wrote a book, and I know you've talked about him before, about Ulysses S. Grant, as you do too, but he tries to really dispel all these misnomers that he was a drunkard and an ineffective leader. This really does dispel that myth. And, it's sad that we were kind of taught that in history because it was during his two terms that he, I guess, fell victim to this mischaracterization.
Yeah, you're exactly right. He was a victim of the lost cause ideology which prevailed for that 100 years. And if you look at Grant through the lens of civil rights, human rights, you see a heroic figure, not a failure.
No, but he owned slaves at one time. So then you see this, and it wasn't like overnight, gee, I had this aha moment, I'm against slavery. You talk about his thinking and his process that changed his mind. That was fascinating.
Sure. I mean, to be fair to Grant, he was never pro-slavery in his entire life.
Right.
His father was an abolitionist.
Right.
Grant was, before the Civil War, an essentially apolitical man. He didn't have much in the way of politics. And he only owned, and very briefly, thanks to the debts, which embarrassed him no end, only one slave in his own name. He was not happy about it, and he freed that man in about a year. After about a year, he couldn't afford to relinquish his labor. initially, but he didn't sell him.
Yeah.
He could have sold the man, but he didn't. He gave him his freedom, even when he was having hard times and could have used the money, but he wouldn't sell a human being. And the war radicalized Grant.
Let's go to the KKK. You describe it as the first organized terrorist movement in American history. How come it wasn't called that back in the 1870s?
Well, it was.
They used that word?
The word terrorism was used. I didn't coin any new terms here. And you'll also encounter the word white supremacy in this book.
Yes.
Not because it's a term that we use at the moment. It was what was used then, and the white reactionaries who formed the Ku Klux Klan and attempted to overthrow Reconstruction were proud of being white supremacists. They used the term. And similarly, people who were victims of the Klan or observing the Klan did use the word terror and terrorism.
Right away, before you even go to your preface, you define what a Republican is back in the 1870s, as well as white supremacy, the word terrorist, and how calling black Americans black was less accepted then as it is today. Why was it important to establish these differences?
Because the language has changed in 150 years. And with respect to the political parties, well, they've kind of flipped compared to the postures they had back in the 1860s and 70s. The Republican Party of the time was the more progressive, dare I say, or I prefer the word forward-looking.
Yes.
For the time. It also supported a stronger central government. The Democratic Party, especially the Southern wing, was absolutely embedded in the world of slavery. It was reactionary. It was not forward-looking. It still was tenaciously demanding or claiming that states had rights paramount to the rights of the federal government, and so on, and more resembles a certain wing of today's Republican Party, in that the Republican Party of a century and a half ago more resembles, generally, the Democratic Party. So you have to have this framework in order to understand what's going on.
Just as a contemporary, I'm living in these times, I had to wrap my brain around it because the Democrat and the KKK were one and the same.
In the South.
In the South, yeah.
Yeah, the KKK was the armed wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. So let's set the stage for our viewers. The Civil War has been over for a couple of years. It's the 1870s, I mentioned. Yes, the North won. Slaves became free men. But too many of these Republicans, these progressives, who are abolitionists, naively believe this illusion that the war settled all the issues. Okay, everything's great now between the North and the South. But the South are saying, no, we have lost our power. And power meant control over their slaves. Describe what was happening in Pulaski, Tennessee, at that time, just south of Nashville.
A group of kind of depressed and bored young Confederate veterans, all of them well-educated, by the way, were looking for a way to entertain themselves and their friends, and they came up with creating this wacky, and it was wacky, fraternity, which they called the Ku Klux Klan.
That name, too, because you described that, is fascinating. It stemmed from these guys. They were a guitar and fiddle group, so I'm like reading that again, huh? And so the evolution is odd.
Yeah, it is odd. I mean, they dressed up in these wacky costumes and so on and would pop up around town, playing their banjos and whatnot.
Yes, so it was kind of a frivolous frivolity.
It was, except for one aspect. One of the things they did to entertain their word themselves was to scare black people, and freed people. The South is kind of in chaos. Law and order is very doubtful everywhere. And whites, of course, were accustomed to doing whatever they wanted toward, around blacks. And they did.
And these are free
people now. But this was not violence at the beginning. It was unkind. It was unkind. It was a bit menacing. But what happened was very rapidly, this organization, this more or less harmless or not too harmful organization, was taken over and revamped by former senior Confederate officers meeting in Nashville. And they saw its potential as a terrorist organization, and it was founded with that intention. It wasn't founded to defend white womanhood or anything of this sort. It was founded as a tool, a weapon, to try to scare freed people back into submission, Two, to destroy the embryonic two-party system in the South, brand new, frail Republican Party. It's biracial,
Right.
which just drives white Democrats up the walls. And it is going to transform the South. And the Democrats, reactionary Democrats, absolutely will stop at nothing to prevent that from happening. So its goal from very early was political, and one of its strategies was to terrify blacks out of politics, and white Republicans also, by the way. Many whites were also killed and abused.
So let's go back to President Grant. He's in office. He's getting these letters from former slaves. And I want, how did you get a hold of those? Because it's you quote them. Is this all in these libraries?
There is an abundance, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of letters written by formerly enslaved people, sometimes writing very painstakingly in newly learned English.
You can see the you can almost phonetically writing out the words.
But often people who had educated themselves very well. There's quite a wide range. But they're writing directly to the president, which Americans generally did in those days. You'd never get a response today, but in those days, people did it very commonly. But thousands are writing to Grant, and these are all in his collected papers.
You share those letters from them, from the white Republicans, particularly from North and South Carolina that was just brutalized. Local and state officials were at risk, so they're all saying, help us, please help us. So now this is the first time we've got people in states turning to the federal government saying, please save us because we're dying here. We're getting lynched, and that's the kindest death. Some of these were horrible tortures. From what you described.
Horrible. I mean, it's
unspeakable. I don't even want to share it.
We won't even talk about it here. Suffice it to say, just about anything cruel that you can imagine people doing to other human beings, the Klan perpetrated, generally on black free people, but also sometimes on white people.
And especially if you were white and had influence and were sympathetic to the cause of freedom for slaves. You would think in Washington, for Grant, it would be a slam dunk to convince Congress that we should do this, we should come and help them. But he had a little bit of a battle in Washington.
He did. Well, bear in mind also that the Klan developed in 1866, and it became kind of turbocharged by 1867-68. Grant isn't elected until the end of 68, becomes president in 69, and he's learning how to be president, too.
He's considered an outsider.
Yes, he was. He was an outsider, non-politician. Right. He really had to kind of learn the job. Right. Also, and he had many things to learn. And the Klan had run rampant now for a few years. How could that happen? Okay, there's this notion that, well, wasn't the South under military occupation? Because the Lost Causers always said it was. Well, it wasn't. At the end of the Civil War, there were 1 million federal troops in the South. That's July of 1865. By 1868, there were only 12,000, which is nothing, spread over 11 states, mostly concentrated in cities. Two, the federal government did not, at that point, have the authority to step in and suppress the Klan, because there's still a tension between what we call states' rights in federal power. And a lot of former Confederates or their sympathizers are already back in power in the southern states, and states are not enforcing even reasonable state laws against the Klan's crime. Well, why would that be? It's because the Klan has so infiltrated already government, the courts, sheriff's offices, the constabulary. Juries won't convict. They're terrified.
So then we now have what we talked about earlier, the progressive idea of this Reconstruction Acts. So explain to us in simple terms what that did and why it was progressive.
We could be here for 3 weeks discussing this, but I'm going to abbreviate things here. But the new legislation that went into effect during Reconstruction temporarily barred a lot of the old aristocracy, the wealthy landowners who had run everything before the war, had barred them from public office, which created space for new people to come in. And bear in mind, not only were all blacks disenfranchised in every sense, before the Civil War, but so were poor whites, because the southern states, for the most part, not all, mostly were oligarchies that were controlled by a very small, rich elite, which was sitting on everybody's backs. Right. Okay, so you had new people. They're all men, so I'm going to say new men, coming up, both black and white, and immensely talented black people who were leaders in their communities
and a threat to these landowners.
Yeah, naturally kind of rose to the top, ran for local offices, because it became possible for blacks to vote in most states before the 15th Amendment made it a national law. That's not widely known. Right. So in 1868, 69, there were talented black people being elected to office, as well as white Republicans locally. And former slaves, as a result of the 14th Amendment, watershed amendment, one of the great amendments in our history, bestows all the rights of citizenship explicitly on everyone, regardless of color. So men can participate in public life and so on. They can sue in court. Black people couldn't sue in a court, except under special circumstances before the war, and so on. All the rights that
Dred Scott ended up doing.
All the rights that we're accustomed to became available to black Americans. And one of the most impressive things in researching this whole subject is how dynamic black communities were in seeking education. Men, women, children, old men, young men, filling schools and becoming literate as fast as they possibly can.
And Klan would target those schools and burn them down.
Burned them.
Torture the teacher. Ugh. But the other thing it did, though, was allowed Grant to send troops in.
Yeah.
Especially to South Carolina. In fact, he had them on martial law. He declared martial law, right?
Finally, what happened was this. Congress, because Congress is behind Grant, basically. Right. Although Grant he walks up to Capitol Hill. Well, he rides his carriage to Capitol Hill, and then he walks into the Capitol.
Yeah, that's a great part of it.
And he makes it clear personally, he's putting his prestige on the line. I need law that is going to enable me to break the Klan. Yeah. And now he has supporters in Congress. They were called the radical Republicans. Right. Radical then just meant they believed in civil rights.
Yes.
It didn't really mean anything. Right. They often were businessmen who had a business orientation. But when it came to rights, they were very, very forward-looking. Right. And Grant begs for and demands legislation. He gets it. It's called a Force Act, or sometimes the Ku Klux Klan Act. Right. And it enables him to do a couple of things. One, in counties that are in a state of insurrection, key word that's used throughout these acts, allows him to suspend habeas corpus. That means to hold people and to use the military to do it if necessary. Now, to keep it in perspective, he only did that in 9 counties in South Carolina, but there was a reason for that. It was just an intense hotbed of violent Klan activity. Maybe 60 to 70% of white men in these several counties were members of the Klan, and a lot of the rest were sympathizers. It's in the hands of the Klan. Okay, so he's got the law now behind him. The law is very specific, targeting or barring, wearing costumes, threatening people, threatening public officials. The penalties are higher if you're caught wearing a costume at night than a day, and there are a whole lot of very specific parts of this legislation that make it clear that the goal is the Ku Klux Klan.
And he was able to back that up with people who would go to the end to make sure that happened, and he follow through.
Yes. The people he musters for this campaign, South Carolina is meant to be the test case. Right. If we can break them there, we can break them anywhere. And he's correct in his analysis. And he has, on one hand, this two-fisted Attorney General, Amos Ackerman. Yes. You look at a picture of him, he doesn't look like a two-fisted kind of guy. Very, very small.
And you do share some photos in the book.
Yeah, but who is a very tough Attorney General who sends prosecutors in. He backs them up with the Department of Justice. He personally goes down to South Carolina to oversee prosecutions. So that's one hand. On the other hand, he sends the 7th Cavalry.
Right.
Now, a lot of people associate the 7th Cavalry perhaps with George Armstrong Custer.
Yeah.
They'd be correct, because that's the cavalry unit that gets massacred or dies, let's say, at the Little Bighorn. Some of these are the same troopers, not Custer. Custer didn't want any part of this. Instead, the 7th Cavalry is commanded by a wonderful guy who's got a Missouri connection, Lewis Merrill, a major who was a rare abolitionist in the officer corps, who spent the Civil War hunting Confederate guerrillas in Missouri. And he was very well known in Missouri. He had a unit of cavalry called Merrill's Horse. Poetry was written to it. It's in the book.
Yep.
And he was a remarkable guy. He was also a lawyer, very well educated, and totally committed to breaking the Klan. And he infiltrated the Klan with spies, both white and black. And, okay, you might say black spies in the Ku Klux Klan, very important. Most of his information came from blacks.
Right.
Because half of the population in those counties is black. White Klansmen, who are often landowners, more affluent people, they don't imagine that the black people are smart enough to know what they're talking about, so they're discussing Klan activity right in front of them. This is all coming back to Merrill. So on one hand, representing Grant, he's got the goods on the Klan. Prosecutions start. He arrests about 1,000 people, about 1,000 in a few counties. Some of them just come in and surrender because they know he's going to get them. And it tells you one thing, and then I'll give you another chance. That the Klan they were tough, and they were big guys when they were murdering or torturing unarmed, helpless, often isolated men, women, and children.
And masked up.
And in masks and so on. They were tough guys. But faced with the 7th Cavalry, they just caved. They were cowards. Of course they were cowards.
They were bullied. Fascinating. It's a great read. Folks, whether you're a Civil War buff or not, it doesn't, well, if you are, you should know this history, but who knows? Learn it. This is great. Thank you for your work. Klan War, Ulysses S. Grant, and the battle to save Reconstruction. Fergus Bordewich, thank you so much for coming to St. Louis, and thank you again for writing the book.
Thank you, Victoria. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.